Hello, how you doing? My name is Antonio. My page is Unapologetically Black ADOS. Ask that you like and subscribe to the page and share this video so that we begin to get this message out. I think it's imperative that if black people want to understand why white people hate us so much, that we have to get to the root of the problem. And the root of the issue that when white people was in Europe, they lived under a monarchy which created the feudal system. And under the feudal system, they had no legal standing. They had no rights. And that is the guidance in which they came to America.
According to Wikipedia, under the English feudal system, the person of the king, asserting his allodial right, was the only absolute owner of land. All nobles, knights and other tenants, termed vassals, merely held land from the king, who was thus at the top of the feudal pyramid.
Them not having any ownership or rights to ownership to land is how they was impoverished, and how the king enriched his cronies of whatever was giving them deeds and access to get resources out of the land. And only those who had rights given to them by the king to have rights to the land was those who were allowed to accumulate wealth. And only those who had land had legal standing in Europe. So the white people who came to America did not have legal standing within the country that they came from. And as a result, you have to see how they lived throughout the Victorian era.
Victorian times, quality of life depended on whether you were rich or poor. Poor people worked as rat catchers.
I get it.
Street sweepers.
I've got it!
Matchstick makers.
I've got it!
Door in factories.
I've got it! I can't do it.
They worked long hours for few luxuries and little money.
Oh, fiddle faddle.
Families would live in damp, filthy apartments, often in one room, and had to share a public bathroom. There were no underground pipes. The sewage ran through the streets.
You can smell it.
You can smell it.
Lots of children died because of disease. Sometimes, if a family was extremely poor and could not pay rent, they lived in a workhouse.
Ouch!
Children did not go to school. Poor families sent their children to work to earn money so the family could eat.
Sweet and sour chicken!
Well, we have to understand that there was no such thing as white people. There was no such thing as white privilege until over here in America. So what I want us to explore is, why was white privilege created? Why did white people never care about the upliftment of white people as the collective until they came into contact with black Americans?
First known as waste people and later white trash, marginalized Americans were stigmatized for their inability to be productive, their failure to own property, their unhealthy children, their lack of any sense of uplift on which the American dream is predicated.
I need black people to understand that Seneca Village was started in 1830 and slavery only ended in New York in 1827. So 3 years after slavery ended, black people was already building thriving black communities, while Europeans who had been released from England bondage since 1977 still was not able at the collective to build vibrant communities.
One Seneca Village, where Central Park is located today in New York City. Did you know before Central Park was created, there was the tiny village of Seneca, where 2/3 of the population was black? This neighborhood was one of the few African-American enclaves at the time where a lot of the residents were homeowners. Seneca Village began in 1825 when landowners in the area began selling some of their land. A 25-year-old black shoe shiner by the name of Andrew Williams bought the first 3 lots for $125.
Seneca Village comprised approximately 70 buildings. There was 3 churches. The first church to be created was the African Union Church. This church also did have a school, and it was one of the few schools that was available for African American students. So it helps us understand Seneca Village as a place where community and church and education was very important.
I need you to understand that the difference in the type of communities that blacks built versus that of Europeans. Black people built more inclusive communities as far as social, economic, political communities, where Europeans built exclusive community where they excluded the majority of their people from participation and impoverished them as a collective.
So did Thomas Jefferson, who proposed that a few promising impoverished white boys might be, quote, raked from the rubbish and given an education. But his bill, drafted in 1779, failed in the Virginia legislature. The ruling elite had little desire to raise up even a few wastrels.
Prime example, you see, we built schools early on whenever we established a community, and you see as far back as the 1700s that Virginia rejected public education because they had no desire to lift the collective of their people up out of their ignorance. This is the difference in the type of communities we build versus them.
He divided the white classes into a descending order of bloodlines. He had the Cavalier gentry at the top, Anglo-Saxons filling the middle and yeoman classes, and those he called Southern bullies and white trash sat at the bottom. These lowest traced their lineage, and this is what he argued, traced their lineage to convicts and indentured servants of Jamestown. They were the befouled heirs of poor vagrants, the rubbish from the back alleys of old London. The vagrant stain was now congenital in the blood.
And all I'm asking people to do is look at the contrast that they stayed in this condition since the 1700s, and this is the condition, this is how blacks begin to progress immediately after being released from bondage. We begin to build strong, vibrant black communities, and you will see this process repeated throughout America.
By 1855, nearly half of the residents in the village owned their own homes, which meant that gave some black men who were homeowners the right to vote. The state of New York at the time required black men to own at least $250 in property and hold residencies for at least 3 years to be able to vote.
He argued that the North had debased their own kind. And he said that the white mudsills of the North were, quote, of your own race. You are brothers of one blood. From Hammond's perspective, the North's flawed labor system had corrupted democratic politics. Discontented whites had been given the vote, and being the majority, it was only a matter of time before these poor northern mudsills orchestrated a class revolution, destroying what was left of the Union.
I need black people to understand that the destruction of Seneca Village under the policies of eminent domain was not about establishing a park. What it was about is politically castrating that black community. That's what that was about, because Europeans understand in order to keep black people in a lower social status that it is necessary for them to use political tactics, because by design, our skills, our abilities, our unity would not allow us to stay in that condition that Europeans had.
It's contrary to the national credo. But the truth is that Americans are quite comfortable rationalizing economic inequality. They have naturalized poverty, determining that it's something beyond human control. By this measure, poor whites were classified as a distinct breed.
See, it took no political efforts to get Europeans to accept their poverty and their lower condition. But with black Americans, it took political process and steps in order to keep us oppressed.
The New York State legislature enacted a law that set aside 775 acres of land in Manhattan to create the country's first major landscape public park. That meant the city was now able to acquire the land where Seneca Village was located through eminent domain, the law that allows the government to take private land for public use with compensation paid to the landowner. Landowners were compensated, but many argue that the land was undervalued. Residents had to leave their village by the end of 1857. It is believed that most of the residents relocated to other African American communities in the area as their safe haven was no longer in existence.
When we look at the Civil War and the debates leading up to it and during the Civil War, what we find is that Lincoln's Republican Party insisted that slavery should not be allowed to spread west because it threatened free labor among the poorer white men.
I need us to be clear and understand that the Civil War had nothing to do with morality, as in white people of the North had a sense of morality about how you was being treated in the South. No, the purpose of the Civil War was that they wanted to expand out west, and that those in the North understood that the South was impoverished due to slavery. So they did not want to expand slavery out west because it would bankrupt, it would impoverish them like it did the poor white trash of the South.
They too needed emancipation, he insisted. And he used the precise term, poor white trash, when he described their pre-war subservience to the planter aristocracy. More and more of the Southern elite held that class subordination was natural, and that Jefferson's, this is what he wrote, Jefferson's "all men are created equal" was, as Hammond insisted, a ridiculously absurd concept. And he was arguing that what was essential to the Southern structure of society was the fixed nature of class identity. In all societies, he said, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life, and he insisted that those with fewer skills, lower order of intellect, they should form the base of every civilized nation.
See, what we don't understand is that those positions was relegated to the majority of whites when they was in Europe. If you look at how they lived throughout the Victorian period, then you will understand why they came over here in mass droves, because they never had any legal standing in Europe.
In Hammond's mind, menial laborers were almost literally mud cells, stuck in the mud, or perhaps a metaphor, quicksand. If all societies had their mud cells, Hammond argued, the South had made the right choice in keeping black slaves in the lowest station.
See, so many of us don't understand why white people hate blacks. The reason why they hate us so much is because in Europe, they was forced into the position that they are trying to relegate us to. See, and white elites never had a need or an interest in empowering white people as a collective, except when it came to empowering them in order to use them as a weapon to prevent us from gaining our full freedom and us displaying our full excellence. This is why they never lifted white people up, never built any public education system for Europeans until after blacks had fought and won their freedom from cattle bondage slavery.
And as you can guess, the Confederate elites were equally afraid of their own white trash, that they might be tempted by the democratic promises and join the revolt. Now, what's interesting about the Civil War, it's not surprising that from the Union's perspective, and from the perspective of Republican politicians, that they would want to exploit the class divisions between the planter elite and poor whites. In General Grant's estimation, The war was fought to liberate not only slaves, but non-slaveholders, those families exiled to poor land who had few opportunities to better themselves.
What you have to understand is the Civil War liberated poor white people as well as black people. But the issue is that black people, when liberated, our skills and our abilities outshine other groups of people, and therefore they have to resort to violence in order to limit our progress. This is why white people was finally empowered with white privilege. Because you will see all the way up into the 1850s, white people were basically squatters. They did not have access to land.
Now, future Confederates responded with a strident defense of their slave and class system. The advanced society had to exploit its petty laborers. The working poor that wallowed in the mud allowed for a superior class to emerge on top.
You have to understand that immediately after slavery, black people formed vibrant communities, starting initially places like Little Rock, Arkansas, where you had Union troops protecting them. So evidently, we are not that menial labor group that lack skills, lack the ability to have upward mobility.
Mount Holly Cemetery is right in close proximity to 9th Street. Something new was happening in Arkansas in terms of just societal change.
The Republicans gained control.
For the first time in the history of Arkansas, we had a new kind of type of African American living here, a black urban middle class.
You know, you're talking about people who understand very well that they have to be self-sufficient, that they have to be self-contained. We're also talking about people who are very intelligent. They understand well the times in which they live and the things that they need to do in order to survive. And also, when we're talking about people who may have been formerly enslaved, that doesn't mean everybody was in the field picking cotton. Some of these people had skills.
The 1870s and 1880s, businesses were being established, especially from Broadway, which was kind of anchored the east end of the West 9th Street Business District, all the way down to Ringo Street. And in that kind of 6-block area, majority were operated by African Americans.
I need you to understand the contrast that slavery ended 1864. This is 1870s. You already see a thriving black community building, where you're talking about Europeans still in poverty 1850, and they won the Revolutionary War in 1774 or 1776. So you have to understand that that group of people who do not have the ability to pull themselves up is not us. It's the methods that they've used in order to keep us impoverished that has us in this position. But if given an equal shot, black people will prosper.
Now, what's interesting about squatters is they were the majority of the population in Kentucky in the 1790s. And they remained 35 to 40% of the population in Tennessee, Alabama, and elsewhere in the Southwest as late as the 1850s. And that's important because these people are prevalent. They're everywhere. And they become, in certain places later in California, a political force. And the one that emerged on top was the true society that embodied all civilization, progress, and refinement.
But again, it's us who repeatedly build vibrant, strong black communities. Wilmington, Carolina, just another example of a vibrant black community that we built 20 years after coming out of chattel slavery. So it's clear that if black people were left to their own vices, that we will have vibrant, strong communities.
In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899.
In step 4, I will discuss how they use white rage as a means to destroy these vibrant black communities, and how they then later on created white privilege in order to prevent black excellence from ever shining.